The ocean kept no secrets from the dead. Beneath the gray, heaving waters of the North Atlantic, in the years between 1939 and 1945, lay the wreckage of nearly 3,500 Allied merchant ships, the broken hulls of nearly 800 German submarines, and the remains of tens of thousands of sailors from both sides. This was the Battle of the Atlantic. It was the longest continuous military campaign of the Second World War. And according to Winston Churchill himself, it was the one struggle that truly frightened him. To understand how this war beneath the waves came to define the entire Allied war effort, we must go back to the bitter lessons of the First World War. Between 1914 and 1918, Germany had deployed its undersea boot, or U-boats, against British and Allied shipping with devastating effect. In 1917 alone, German submarines sank over 6 million tons of Allied shipping, nearly bringing Britain to her knees. When war returned in September 1939, Germany's naval commander-in-chief, Admiral Erich Raeder, and the head of the U-boat arm, Commodore Karl Dönitz, were determined to finish what had been started 2 decades earlier. At the outbreak of war, Dönitz commanded a force of just 57 operational U-boats, of which only 22 were capable of reaching the Atlantic shipping lanes. It was a painfully small number. Dönitz had calculated that he needed a minimum of 300 submarines to effectively strangle Britain's supply lines. He would not receive that number for years. Nevertheless, in those early months of the war, the U-boats made their presence felt with brutal efficiency. On the 3rd of September 1939, hours after Britain declared war on Germany, the German submarine U-30 torpedoed and sank the British passenger liner Athenia off the northwest coast of Ireland, killing 117 civilians. The war at sea had begun. The U-boats used in the Battle of the Atlantic were primarily the Type VIIc, a vessel of around 761 tons displacement when submerged. These submarines measured approximately 67 meters in length, carried 14 torpedoes, and were crewed by around 44 to 52 men. They could travel at 17 knots on the surface and 8 knots submerged. When diving, they could reach a maximum operational depth of around 230 meters, though some survived even greater depths through structural luck. Life aboard was claustrophobic, wet, and exhausting. The interior reeked of diesel fuel, sweat, and mildew. Crewmen slept in shifts on bunks wedged between torpedo racks. The psychological toll on these young men, many of them teenagers, was immense. Between the summer of 1940 and the end of 1941, the U-boat crews would refer to this period as the glückliche Zeit, the happy time. The fall of France in June 1940 was a turning point. With Atlantic ports such as Lorient, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, and La Pallice now in German hands, U-boats could reach the mid-Atlantic 2 to 3 days faster than before, dramatically extending their operational range. In July 1940, alone, U-boats sank 38 ships, totaling over 195,000 gross registered tons. In October 1940, 2 Wolfpacks, as Dönitz's coordinated group tactics were known, attacked Convoy SC-7 and Convoy HX-79 in consecutive nights. 32 ships were sunk in just 48 hours. The Royal Navy escorts were overwhelmed. They had too few ships, inadequate radar, and were operating with doctrine that had not anticipated the scale or ferocity of night surface attacks. The Wolfpack tactic, known in German as Rudeltaktik, was Dönitz's greatest tactical innovation. Rather than hunting alone, U-boats would spread across hundreds of miles of ocean in a patrol line. When one submarine spotted a convoy, it would radio headquarters in Lorient, shadowing the target and guiding additional submarines into attack positions. At night, the U-boats would surface to press home their attacks, taking advantage of their low silhouettes, which were almost impossible to detect visually in darkness. Dönitz would coordinate the attacks personally from the shore, sending precise operational orders through encrypted radio signals using the Enigma machine. This reliance on radio would ultimately prove to be both Germany's greatest strength and its fatal weakness. Britain's survival depended entirely on the convoy system. Each week, dozens of merchant vessels laden with food, fuel, steel, ammunition, and raw materials crossed the Atlantic in tightly organized groups under naval escort. Without these convoys, Britain would have been starved into surrender within months. The mathematics were merciless. Britain required around 1 million tons of imported material every week, simply to sustain its war effort and feed its population. Every ship sunk represented not only lost cargo but lost crewmen, men who were overwhelmingly civilians sailing into one of the most dangerous environments in human history. Over 36,000 merchant seamen from the Allied nations perished during the course of the campaign. The year 1942 brought the war to new waters. Following the United States' entry into the conflict after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Dönitz launched Operation Drumbeat, known in German as Paukenschlag, against the American eastern seaboard in January 1942. American authorities had refused to implement a blackout along the coast or organize convoys, and U-boats exploited this catastrophically. American ships were silhouetted against the lights of coastal cities, making them easy targets. In the first 6 months of 1942, U-boats sank over 3 million tons of Allied shipping in American and Caribbean waters. It was the worst period of shipping losses of the entire war. By the middle of 1942, the Allies were losing ships faster than they could build them. The turning point came not in a single dramatic battle, but through a convergence of technologies, intelligence breakthroughs, and sheer industrial output. The cracking of the German naval Enigma cipher by the codebreakers at Bletchley Park in Britain was one of the most decisive secret achievements of the war. The capture of Enigma materials from the German submarine U-110 in May 1941 gave British naval intelligence access to German naval codes. Although the Germans upgraded their Enigma system with a fourth rotor in February 1942, causing a temporary blackout in Allied intelligence known as the Shark Blackout, the codebreakers at Bletchley eventually broke into the new cipher by December 1942. From that point on, Allied convoys could often be rerouted around waiting wolf packs, saving hundreds of ships. Equally decisive was the closing of the Mid-Atlantic Gap, the area beyond the range of land-based aircraft that U-boats had exploited as a killing ground for years. Very long-range B-24 Liberator aircraft, operating from bases in Iceland, Northern Ireland, and Newfoundland, eventually extended air cover across the entire Atlantic by mid-1943. U-boats were now vulnerable around the clock. The introduction of cinemetric radar, specifically the 10-centimeter ASV Mark III radar fitted to Allied aircraft and escort vessels, meant that U-boats could no longer rely on their ability to surface safely at night. Previously, U-boats had been alerted by British radar transmissions using a device called the METOX receiver. But the new centimetric radar operated on a wavelength that METOX could not detect, catching surface submarines completely by surprise. The use of Lee lights, powerful airborne searchlights that could be switched on at the moment of attack after radar contact had been established, allowed Allied aircraft to press home attacks on surfaced U-boats at night with devastating accuracy. Hunter-killer groups, built around escort carriers and dedicated anti-submarine warships, began to systematically hunt and destroy U-boats rather than simply defending convoys. The deployment of the Hedgehog, a forward-throwing anti-submarine mortar that fired a pattern of 24 contact-fused bombs ahead of the attacking ship, dramatically increased the kill rate against submerged submarines compared to the conventional depth charge. The crisis point for the U-boat arm came in May 1943, in what would be remembered by German naval historians as Schwarzer Mai, Black May. In that single month, the Allies sank 41 German submarines. Dönitz lost more submarines in May 1943 than he had lost in all of 1942 combined. The losses were unsustainable. On the 24th of May 1943, Dönitz made a decision of enormous strategic significance. He withdrew the wolf packs from the North Atlantic. He did not use the word defeat, but the withdrawal was precisely that. Writing in his war diary, he acknowledged that the U-boats had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. Germany never recovered this strategic position for the remainder of the war. Dönitz continued to send U-boats into the Atlantic, equipping them with new anti-aircraft armament, seeking to develop the Schnorkel, a breathing tube that allowed submarines to run their diesel engines while submerged, and experimenting with new acoustic torpedoes such as the Zaunkönig, known to the Allies as the GNAT, which could home in on the propeller noise of escort ships. The Schnorkel technology, when widely deployed in 1944, allowed U-boats to remain submerged for far longer periods, reducing their vulnerability to aircraft. But these were measures of desperation rather than recovery. The fundamental strategic equation had already been decided. The human cost of the U-boat campaign was staggering on both sides. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served in the German U-boat arm during the war, around 28,000 were killed, and 5,000 were taken prisoner. The casualty rate of approximately 75% made the U-boat service the deadliest branch of the German armed forces. The average life expectancy of a U-boat crew on their first operational patrol in the final years of the war was measured in weeks. On the Allied side, the merchant marine suffered losses that have never received the public recognition given to regular military forces. These civilian sailors, who had no weapons, no means of fighting back, and no choice but to sail into waters patrolled by submarines, were among the bravest men of the war. The Battle of the Atlantic was not won by any single weapon, tactic, or technology. It was won by the combination of signals, intelligence, airborne radar, long-range aircraft, escort carrier groups, improved anti-submarine tactics, the heroism of Allied sailors, and above all, by the extraordinary industrial capacity of the United States, which by 1943 was launching new Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. The Kaiser Shipbuilding Company in California built the Liberty ship Robert E. S. Peary in a record 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes in November 1942, a stunt designed to demonstrate America's industrial power to the world. When the war ended in May 1945, the final accounting was made. German submarines had sunk 2,935 Allied merchant ships, totaling approximately 14.5 million gross registered tons of cargo capacity. They had also sunk 175 Allied warships. In return, 833 German U-boats had been lost to all causes, the vast majority of them to Allied action. The Battle of the Atlantic had lasted 5 years, 8 months, and 5 days without interruption. From the 3rd of September 1939 to the 8th of May 1945. It was, at its core, a battle about the most fundamental question of modern warfare: the ability to supply and sustain a nation and an army across thousands of miles of open ocean. Germany came closer to winning that battle than most histories have acknowledged. Had Dönitz received his 300 submarines in 1939 rather than 1943, had the Enigma ciphers not been broken, had the very long-range aircraft been deployed even 6 months later, the outcome of the entire Second World War might have been profoundly different. The Gray Atlantic still holds its dead. Their sacrifice, on both sides of the periscope, shaped the world we inhabit today.